Hello and welcome to this episode of CXM Conversations. My name is Suzanne Steele and I'm joined today by Professor Linda A. Hill to explore how business leaders can help drive the growth agenda and some of the challenges they may face along the way. Thank you so much for joining me, Linda.
It's really my pleasure.
It's great to have you with us. So let's kick off the conversation. Let's start with, I'd love to understand, what is your perspective on how well organizations are adjusting to changing customer needs and expectations this year?
What I want to say is that what I see is that really this has been a traumatic year on so many levels for so many people. But as one of the leaders did say to me, we've all been in the same storm, but frankly, we haven't been in the same boat. What I do see, though, is that leaders are taking the time now to reflect on what they've discovered about their organizations. And they've discovered their organizations are more resilient than they thought. They've discovered that there's a lot more leadership in the organization that has been unleashed. But they've also discovered that they need to accelerate becoming more agile, figuring out how to innovate and provide new experiences for their customers.
And that's a great point. So how well do many of those companies really understand customer needs today, given the disruption of last year and 2020? Do you really feel they understand those customer needs, or are we really starting from scratch?
I think we really need to think about starting from scratch. So for the last 20 years, I've been studying exceptional leaders of innovation, leaders who've built organizations that can innovate time and again. Some of these leaders have built these organizations from scratch, but many have really been in the transformation process. And so we've been collecting data for years about these different organizations. And one of the things we find is that very few companies actually score high on what we refer to as customer intimacy. They didn't really know their customers all that well before the pandemic, so they certainly don't necessarily know them well enough now to figure out what to do. And even those companies that did know their customers very well, what they're saying is we need to learn and know them again. So one of the leaders I was speaking to said, this is not really a time for us to be selling to our customers. This is a time for us to be serving our customers and to truly engage with them and understand what their new needs are.
Totally agree with that. I think that customer intimacy in the past has been possibly lacking. And now, with all of the different customer touch points and all of the different data points, knowing the customer in the moment, it's absolutely critical.
Yes, indeed. And you got to get to learn them again. And what is really important is as you're building those relationships with the customers to get to know them, there's both quantitative and qualitative data you need. But I am hearing very much that it's a time to try to engage with them deeply, to show them that, in fact, you are a trusted partner, that you do care, and help them figure out ways that they can transform their businesses to service their customers better is what they're looking for from their partners.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you talked about empathy, and we're certainly at Adobe hearing that it's that infusion of data and empathy coming together and using that to really understand the customer in the moment. So just thinking about that, and we think about, the impact that technology is having, what do you think about the new and emerging technologies that we're seeing and the impact they will have on our ability to gain customer insights and reduce those internal friction points?
I do think that the new technologies are truly driving all of this. And one of the things that's important that I want to say about the new technologies is, again, if you want to engage the whole organization and help them understand how to use these tools, many people are afraid of technology. Having said what I said about you do have the digital natives, but you have a lot of other people who are actually afraid of it and don't think that they know how to use it or don't know how to really interpret data. I mean, the data analytics piece of the puzzle is something that we're trying to help executives and frankly, the MBA is more about how to use those various tools. So one of the things I do want to say up front is that when we are upskilling our people and making sure that they do have the talent or the capabilities they need, one part of it that makes a huge difference in terms of tools, and I love looking at your website, is tools that allow people to visualize complex data, to see patterns, etc. So if you want to engage people and collaborate and use data, you can't, you've got to give it to them in a way that it's not that the data scientist sort of reads it and knows how to use it. You've got to give it to them in a way that they can actually make sense of it. And so it's fascinating. In one of the companies we were working in, they gave some of these digital tools to actually nurses. In this instance, it was in a hospital, and they suddenly came up with all their own personalized dashboards, to help them understand what was happening on their unit and what they could do, et cetera, without anyone asking them to do them. In fact, there were so many of them, they had to kind of say, well, how are we going to put some discipline on the use of all these tools? Because people are visual, and particularly going back to data and how you help people have that 360 view of the customer or even of what they're trying to do in their work. When you make it simple, you take the complex and make it simple because you give them pictures of it, or they have the capacity to draw those pictures themselves or put together what they want to. It just unleashes so much creativity. People begin to discover, we could be doing this. I never knew that this worked this way. And once they begin to understand how to read those patterns and figure it out, and it's given to them in a way that they can absorb it, it's unbelievable. I cannot tell you how many companies are now also saying, how do we put some discipline in here? We actually kind of have too much innovation. We had not enough before, but now people have all kinds of ideas, and we need to figure out how to put some discipline to make that efficient. So that's a wonderful problem to have. And it really has begun to happen in this past year because companies have accelerated sort of introducing these tools because they've had to.
Yeah, and I think, accelerating innovation and getting insight into the hands of people who can actually then apply that and take the insight and do something with it rather than just giving them the analytics or the data is really the key. And making insight available for action is really key in all of that, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it is. It is about insight. As one of the leaders said, before we used to have systems that only gave us hindsight.
Yeah.
Now we have systems that give us insight and also foresight. Yeah. And so he said, with that foresight, what could we be doing? How can we anticipate what our customers are going to need and begin to offer them whatever that might be? So we've gone from hindsight to insight, hopefully to foresight, with what people can see because of tools like, and I'm not trying to flatter you, but really the kinds of tools you've made available to people that just the average person can use to kind of figure out some stuff and figure out how to be more productive on their job or whatever it might be. It's been really fascinating for me to see.
And foresight and the ability to predict what's coming and what customers expect in their experiences down the line is absolutely critical as we sort of emerge from the last year. So with that, Linda, a lot of that insight and hindsight and now foresight, it's all data driven, right? And yes. So let's talk a little bit about, you talked about trust earlier, and really protecting customer data is absolutely essential. Love to hear from you. What issues or considerations do you think leaders need to keep top of mind as they focus on, using that data and growing their abilities in data and analytics around that trust ecosystem?
Yes, and one of the things we're doing a big project on what do you need to know if you're a leader in the digital age. And one thing that keeps coming up is really sort of the ethical dimension, if you will. The first thing is you have to have that obsession with the customer and be very focused on their needs. And if you're not, of course, you're never going to really do things in a way that will probably be ethical. But what they're doing is before you, as you're designing, if you will, that product, that service, or the way of doing things, they think up front about what are the principles that we want to make sure we hold dear. And this is really what integrity means, so that we continue to earn the trust of the customer. And so I do see companies putting in place more professionals and having more discussions right up front about those ethical considerations. Because as we all know, AI, all of these different tools can be used for good, but they also can have very unintended consequences that are just terrible for certain customers or for society. So they try to think those things through and really take not just a strategic point of view, but a systemic point of view to really think through those unintended consequences. Again, they're still going to have to make judgment calls about things. The second thing I see that companies are doing, besides saying, we have to earn the trust and maintain the trust of the customer, so let's think through those principles we want to operate on. The other thing that I see is companies are being very careful to really ask themselves, why do we need those data? Only collect the data that you truly need, because too many companies actually collect data willy-nilly. And once you have the data, just because you have it, should you use it? So why be very conscious up front about what data do we think we really need to meet the needs of the customer, and don't have a lot of extra, if you will, but there's also security risks and other things, but only collect the data that you actually think you need to really help the customer. And what we also see again is companies trying to become somewhat ever more transparent about how the data are going to be used. Now, different parts of the world already have regulation that requires for more of that transparency than some. I mean, the U.S. doesn't have as much regulation as other parts of the world. But I think companies think regulation is not really enough. It's about the relationship you're trying to build long-term with the customer, and really stepping into their shoes and saying what's really in their best interest what's really in their best interest. But again, thinking about more systemically about the unintended consequences of collecting certain data and what you're going to be able to learn, because you can gain a lot of insight and foresight. And some of that, the customer may in fact pay a price for the fact that certain things, or maybe you're not going to use it, but someone else that you may share that data with might use it in ways that you don't intend. So again, the other thing I'm saying is that companies are talking to their partners and their clients, but how they're going to use the data that you're helping them collect in a way just to help them think through that a bit, because they want to make sure that they are companies of integrity that, again, are trusted in the end.
Yeah, and it's beyond the regulatory environment, isn't it? The regulatory environment is table stakes, isn't it? And then I think that point that you raised, which is really valid, about ethics and, why do you really need that data, and what's the risk of retaining that data is really important. Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor and a privilege to have you talking to us and sharing your experience and your insights today.
Thank you.